Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 11th of November 2015, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host this afternoon, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio behind the technical desk is Mike Robinson, and we're going to be joined by a live video Skype link by Alex Thompson from Eastern Approaches. And Alex will be joining us on a regular basis from now on, and he will be covering what's really happening in Europe and where possible, with a special emphasis on what is happening in Eastern Europe. So I'm sure that our viewers and listeners are going to find that very interesting. Well, before we get going, let's have a little bit of a comment on the weather. Pretty grey, mizzy, dull here in Plymouth. Much the same, we understand, up north of the border, Glasgow at least. Rhondda's not looking too good. But the bright news on the horizon is that there's a little bit of breakthrough and it's clearing in the Netherlands. Well, of course, if the weather's not too good, everything is rosy when it comes to money and economics. I think it's over to you, Mike.
Yeah, well, indeed, because today seems to be Bank of England Propaganda Day. We've got this article in the Bank of England, in the Guardian here. Inside the Bank of England, it's a long article. Do go and have a look at it. Extremely interesting. We'll come back to that in a moment. So why was that published today? Well, because today is the Bank of England Open Forum, an open discussion on the role of markets in society. And of course, depends on your definition of the word market. So it was led off by Alan Yarrow, who's the Lord Mayor of the City of London, Lord Mayor of London. And really his point was the City of London is the best. And everybody, I'm sure, agrees with that because the City of London is a wealth creator. It provides excellent service to everyone, not just banks. And we've got to remember it's charitable giving through City Giving Day, which was the 30th of September. But the whole point of this exercise by the Bank of England, according to Alan Yarrow, is it is a chance to change the narrative. It's not a chance to change the culture. It's not a chance to change the practices. It's a chance to change the narrative, and that's really what this is about. So we're going to, I think, launch another new hashtag today, which is hashtag Bank of England PSYOP, because that's really what this is about. So he was followed up by Mark Carney, and Mark Carney, of course, talking about the reform process, and he's saying that this reform process has been largely the regulators, the Treasury, the banks, domestically and internationally, talking to each other. It's time to hear from a much broader fora of people. So they're claiming that they're listening to the public, and naturally he was followed on by the Chancellor. And he was making the point that if you go and shoplift at the local WH Smith's, you go to prison. But if you're the market trader on the trading floor of a big investment bank and you rip off people to the tune of millions of pounds, there are no criminal offences available to deal with you, because apparently fraud is not a criminal offence, it seems. But anyway, so he was going on, and really this was the story of the morning, was self-congratulatory. No one's gone to prison for the corruption, but we're going to deal with it through new regulatory processes, which of course they're not. So during the question and answer session, a question was asked of people in Manchester. Do you think financial markets had a key role in creating the financial crisis and the recession that we experienced in the UK? And as you can see there, everybody put their hands up. And the next question was, are you now confident that the financial markets are operating in an ethical way that would prevent such a crisis and recession hitting us again? And no hands went up. So everybody understands the reality of the situation reasonably well. But somebody who doesn't understand the reality of the situation was one of the commenters, and this comment really stuck out for me. And this is the comments at the end of that Guardian article I showed at the beginning of this piece. And this person says, the Bank of England is a component of the national government of the UK, nothing more, nothing less. It is the government's bank, the same government that issues the pound. The Bank of England or any central bank is in no way independent other than in myth and in the minds of New Labour, Gordon Brown and friends. If the Bank of England could indeed control the rate of inflation, then Carney and his staff would be fired for gross incompetency. The Bank of England cannot create the pound. Only the government, by spending the pound into existence, can do that. However, the Bank of England is the lender of last resort to those financial institutions that have reserve and security account status with the bank. There is so much wrong with that comment. It is unbelievable. So if we just briefly comment here, the Bank of England is a component of national government of the UK, according to this person. Well, the national government of the UK owns the Bank of England, but the Bank of England is operationally independent. It provides wholesale banking services to many others other than the government, including private clients. There is no, we've mentioned this many times before, but there's no accountability, no transparency with regard to the operation of the Bank of England. It's more or less exempt from the Freedom of Information Act, for example. And through many of its trading practices, it operates on behalf of other heads of state, our own notional head of state, as well as the government. Of course, the other major point about this is that the government has nothing to do with the issuance of currency in this country. That's why they're so determined to ignore the Bradbury Pound campaign at the moment. So I think the Bradbury Pound probably the only time that government has actually issued its own currency in that sense. So plenty wrong with that comment. But just to finish off, the whole point of this changing of the narrative, as the Lord Mayor of London was trying to persuade us was what this event was about, of course, is the new regulatory framework that's being established. Now, instead of splitting up the banks, because Carney today on Sky News, for example, was suggesting that the key point about this was to get rid of the too big to fail. And this is always the rhetoric that they roll out. We've got to get rid of this too big to fail business. And that banks should be treated like any other business. That's absolutely correct. They should be treated like any other business. There should be no such thing as too big to fail. But the mechanism that they've put in place, or they are putting in place to try to prevent this too big to fail, is the ring fence. And they're already watering that down. So without complete separation of the commercial banks and the investment banks, where investment banks could then carry on their activities without any endangerment to the commercial banks that we rely on to provide our retail banking services. Without that complete separation, there never will be an end to too big to fail. And this notion of the taxpayer not carrying the burden, of course, is nonsense, because the bailout principle, where governments bailed out the banks, is being replaced with bail-in. And as we've said many times, what that means is that us as savers end up as being creditors of the bank, and therefore they take our money in order to bail in the banks. So this is not about changing anything other than the narrative. So it's a piece of propaganda. It's a psyop.
Like these people must be under pressure if they've had to go, in my opinion anyway, to go to this extent to try and smooth over their image, get people to love bankers. You need to be able to love bankers. These are worried people, aren't they?
Absolutely.
Okay, well, if that's the situation at the moment in UK, and I'll just add to that, it's getting very interesting, of course, that senior members of the Labour Party did actually sign the early day motion backing the Bradbury Pound. And Justin Walker from the British Constitution Group has been asking some penetrating questions now of the Labour leadership as to whether they're going to stand by their pledge to support the Bradbury. At the moment, there has been a little bit of hesitancy, a little bit of silence, but we do understand that it appears there may be some dialogue coming out on this. So we will keep people posted. But of course, what is the solution to this utter madness of private banks creating money from nothing? It is for the government to be issuing our own money as credit, as indeed happened with the Bradbury Pound. Well, in France, we've got something else going on at the moment, and that's the charging for current accounts. Let's bring in Alex. Are you there? Yes, he is. Okay. So, go ahead.
Hoe gaat het, Brian?
Niet te slecht. That's about as good as I can get live. Not too bad. Okay, well, Alex, tell us what's been happening in France and what these charges mean.
Yes, well, the headline comes from Les Echos, the Echoes, which is the French financial and economic paper. So it's not just your regular broadsheet article. It's actually specifically for people who are interested in money. And unfortunately, it's just an apology for the banks. The headline there, as you can see on screen, says Pourquoi les comptes courants deviennent payants? Why current accounts are starting to be charged for. And in a rather thin article, we're simply told that all the French high street banks are introducing what are euphemistically called account holding fees, or account holders fees, if you like. And the most expensive bank to bank with in France as of New Year will be Banque Nationale de Paris, Paribas, BNP for short, and that will be charging you €2.50 a month from the 1st of January for the privilege of holding your money with them. And I'll just give you one more detail about the article. It has 3 headings, which are the bank's own excuses for why they have to do so, and they are s'aligner sur la concurrence, which means the competitors are all doing it, and we have to get in line with them. The second is coûts informatiques et humains. There are technology and human costs involved in running banks. And the third is la gratuité des banques en ligne. So online banks are free. So why would you expect us to be free? Because we have higher costs. So I wonder whether you or Mike have any comments about those excuses.
Oh, I'm going to pass that one to Mike, I think.
Is the article suggesting this is new, Alex?
Unfortunately, it is. And I know that at least in Britain, we used to have such charges back in the 90s, didn't we?
Yeah, and they're still talking about bringing them back. I mean, they're talking about that on a regular basis. But my bank account in France, do I have a bank? Yes, I do. My bank account in France is charged for. It is a small amount, but that's been going on. But that's, who is that? Crédit Agricole. So maybe this is something which is being brought out right across the board now then?
Well, somebody in the chat room is saying that they're getting a monthly £5 charge on their current account. So the minimum we can say on this, of course, is that the banks are desperate for money and are increasingly going to look at ways to take more money from people. Well, the other subject you've raised, Alex, is Brexit, and this is a French view on it as well from Atlantico here.
Yes, now Atlantico is written in French, and you would be surprised that they're actually making arguments of this kind to a French-speaking audience, unless it's for the large number of francophones in the posh parts of London who've flocked there since the tax rates went up to 75% under Hollande. But if that's not the case, then the target audience is on the continent. And the headline here is « Ces raisons pour lesquelles le Brexit est bien plus probable que l'on ne croit ». The reasons why Brexit is rather more probable than you might think. And there's, again, not much substance in this. It's an interview with a certain Philippe Legrand. And it's really telling people that referenda, this is a direct quote from Legrand, who's being interviewed. He says, well, referenda tend to be driven by emotion rather than by reason. This is what he's saying in French. It's my translation. And of course, most voters are risk averse, but it would be over-complacent to assume that the status quo option of staying in the EU will inevitably triumph.
Right. So are you, I know that you're in Holland, but are you aware of the sorts of things the French are discussing? Do they discuss David Cameron at all?
They have more than other European nations. They have very cynical readers writing under articles. And by the way, French newspapers, although they're supposed to be hot on privacy and not being sued, always leave their articles open for comment. They never close them for fear of being sued like many a British paper does. And usually the top-rated article on anything to do with Brexit or the UK position in the EU is, why don't the Brits just leave? It doesn't suit them to be in the EU.
Right, so they're very black and white over it. If you don't like it, get out.
Yes.
It's interesting. And are there people in France that have a similar position about France itself?
Yes, a huge number. Right down the eastern side of France, there's a large vote now for the National Front. Simply, that's the half of the country that's post-industrial and depressed and full of immigrants and factories that aren't working anymore. So that explains the voting for the National Front. But no, there's plenty of French who are voting for the National Front now under Marine Le Pen, and that's of course the daughter of the founder, Jean-Marie Le Pen, who's very well known. They actually are returning as proud nationalists, which the French always are, to a simple position of sovereignty. When the French president goes to address the MEPs, for example, in Brussels, the National Front's MEPs in the chamber just say, well, welcome, Mr. President, you have less sovereignty over your own country than an American governor of a state does, which is absolutely true.
Yeah.
So the French are very well aware of this. There's many French language articles posted under views of Nigel Farage or others who are in the chamber in Brussels who are arguing for nations to regain their sovereignty.
Okay, thank you for that. And Germany, of course, we are hearing at least something of what's going on, and we understand the situation is getting quite tense in Germany with unhappiness, particularly at immigration. But there's been a demonstration recently where there were calls for Merkel to resign.
There was, and bear in mind that this is 5,000 demonstrators demanding Merkel's resignation, and we're not taking this from Breitbart, by the way. I've read the original German article in Handelsblatt, which, like the French Les Echos, is actually written to speak truth to businessmen. Handelsblatt is actually not based in Berlin because it's not interested in political news. It's interested in what's really happening. And from Frankfurt, I believe it is, and Hamburg, they report on the heart of German business affairs. So this is the news as it affects hard cash, and when it hits people in the pocket. That's what Handelsblatt is interested in. It means the trade journal. So the fact that they report on 5,000 demonstrators demanding Merkel's resignation is quite something. It was actually a newish political party called Alternative für Deutschland, an alternative for Germany, that held this rally. And it was unthinkable enough till a couple of years ago that such a party would exist, calling for Germany to leave the euro and eventually to leave the EU. What's unusual about this is that the mainstream media in Germany, which is now funded by a BBC-style tax because their numbers were crashing, they sent journalists with rather pointed, insinuating questions into the audience in these protests, expecting, because it's Germany, that people would give polite, rather embarrassed responses when they were asked about, isn't this all a bit too nationalist? But things have changed, and German pensioners, even younger German people, were telling these elite journalists to take a long walk off a short plank, effectively, because they've had enough of being told that it's unthinkable that Germany should leave the euro or that there should be less immigration. There's even stories of certain places in Germany now having so many immigrants, more immigrants than the local population being put up in a local barracks, that these immigrants, whatever they are, walk into churches on Sunday mornings, a Roman Catholic one in the case I've read about, and start a riot.
Right. Alex, you're working as a professional translator. Do your language skills allow you to see any of the material that's circulating amongst the immigrant groups? Do we get an insight into what sort of information and comment is going around inside the immigrants coming to Germany?
I could go looking for that, but I haven't specifically. One thing I would say is that a surprising number of these so-called penniless Syrian refugees, and I certainly accept many have had horrible experiences, but a large number of them are more comfortable talking in English directly to the camera than they are in Arabic. And they seem to have the latest smartphones and be texting in English. And I've even seen one interview in which a rather fashionable young lady said, when she got to, I forget which European country, "I don't like this camp. The bathrooms are like really gross." Now, is that the off-scouring of the earth?
Yeah. Okay, well, hopefully we're going to be able to dig deeper into some of these things. But of course, Germany seems to be under the magnifying glass of the security services, much as UK at the moment.
I just found this a delicious irony, really, that Der Spiegel, I'll read a couple of paragraphs quickly, has dug up exactly what the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the German Federal Intelligence Service, has been doing. And it's the exact copy of what Merkel has taken Obama and Cameron to task for. Der Spiegel writes, this is an English language article, since October's revelations, it has emerged that the BND spied on the United States Department of the Interior. Now, the US is not a European political system. The US Department of the Interior is simply a land management agency. And the interior ministries of EU member states. The search terms used by BND in its espionage also included communications lines belonging to US diplomatic outposts in Brussels and the UN in New York. Well, the point is that I'm not outraged by this, but the point is that this is what countries do to each other.
Yes.
If you haven't signed a treaty with another state, agreeing explicitly not to spy on them, then there's no reasonable expectation of not being spied on, is there?
This is true. And you've also picked out a Telegraph article, which is basically saying that we trust our spies too much.
This one I found too good to pass up on, because Janet Daly is one of these commentators in the Telegraph that actually knows what she's writing about. And she came as, I think, a young adult to Britain. And she writes as a critical friend and someone who's integrated into British life. And with that unfailing eye that the Americans have for complacency among the British, she writes that the British express casual contempt for their politicians, but, and this is her quote still, the British do very largely see their politicians as basically civilized, benign characters who will not resort to brutality or deliberate criminal deception. This assumption, that's by the British people, applies even to the security forces, whose secrecy and general invisibility are accepted, i.e. in Britain, as part of a sophisticated global game. And Janet Daly not finishes, but one of the main things she says is that Americans know very well that in a common law democracy, there has to be probable cause, a reasonable ground for suspecting someone of wrongdoing before you spy on them. That's something that Americans will quote directly to police officers when they come without a warrant or demand to look in a car. Do you have probable cause? Do you have probable cause? And usually it ends in the retreat of the policeman if there's nothing going on that requires investigation. But, of course, we don't speak in these terms in Britain. We invented the doctrine, but we don't speak about it. So we're sitting ducks for tyranny.
Sitting ducks for tyranny. That's an interesting statement. Well, of course, you worked for a period at GCHQ. Do you think that we're under threat from our own intelligence services?
Well, I was on the panel at Telford for Doomwatch 57 this spring, and someone in the audience asked that question. And what I say then is still my view. The vast majority of people in the intelligence agencies themselves are not only very patriotic, but they're deeply cynical about political leadership in Britain. And they have no agenda other than keeping the country safe. What we can rightly fear, I think, is abuse of all this new bulk data on the British people themselves. Abuse by police, politicised police, whose training is something you've highlighted. Abuse by council staff, who are acting like little tyrants these days. Possibly by political parties or NGOs, the third sector. And abuse also possibly within the agencies by clueless raw recruits who've never been schooled in the Constitution.
OK, well, thank you for that, Alex. Of course, we might also just continue to ask the question as to why heads of Britain's intelligence services can go off to, where was it, Gleneagles, to meet up with business leaders behind closed doors. But we've also been watching other things going on really at the heart of Parliament. And thank you very much to the person who texted us through a heads up on this article. This is Hansard report from the 4th of November. And a debate was going on. Baroness Neville Rolfe was speaking out. She said that she'd been to the OHIM in Alicante a couple of weeks ago, the cyber security office. So this was all a cyber security debate. And she went on to say that we're going to target action to help small businesses. So the debate is cyber security. But everything I picked up in reading through this report is that basically this is big government action to spy and draw in businesses. Now, other people may disagree, but I followed this through. What was she talking about? Well, here she is. She's talking about the Office for Harmonisation in the Internal Market. It's a European Union agency responsible for managing two important vehicles for the protection of creativity and innovation, the community trademark and the registered community design. So if you read the all about this, this was all trust us, we're only there to help you. What did they sort of talk about? Well, the rising number of registrations that they're dealing with. So they put figures here. So UK apparently 11.2%. I think 11.26% of all businesses already registered with them. And they even boasted of where they were getting to in America. That's at 18.29%. So this is quite an interesting happening going on behind the scenes. And okay, there was some debate in the House of Lords about it. So what else can we bring in with that? Well, this organisation here, the European Union Agency for Network and Information Security. This is where, for me, you started to see the whole thing being knitted together. You're saying, well, if you've got a registered online trademark, we need to know about you. But here is this agency for network and information security. And what are they going to be doing? Well, this is what they say their tasks are: to enhance the capability of the Commission, other EU bodies and member states to prevent, address and respond to NIS problems, assistance to deliver advice to the Commission, develop a high level of expertise and use this expertise to stimulate broad cooperation between actors from the public and private sectors. I wonder what an actor is. To assist the Commission where called upon in the technical preparatory work for updating and developing their legislation. So this is really all about control. And the lady who is in the middle of this is Baroness Neville Rolfe. Here she is, DBE CMG, Parliamentary Under Secretary of State and Minister for Intellectual Property. She's got quite an interesting background because she worked at Tesco PLC as an executive director on the main board from 2006. She's been on the boards of ITV, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Metro AG, China Britain Business Council, chairman of Dobbies Garden Centre, president of EU Commerce, the EU Trade Association, and on it goes, including DEFRA, I believe at a time when they were trialling the Behavioural Insights team. So this lady seems to have an immense amount of power, and what is she doing behind the scenes? She's building a power base for the EU to continue to spy on us. What I think is going on here is the start of registration of all companies under the cover of cybersecurity. And I will come back to you, Alex, on this, but I'll just run through into this topic, which I think goes in parallel. This is the other gentleman who was speaking in this debate, Lord Mendelssohn. His predecessor was Lord Levy, close friend. Mendelssohn had been involved in a company called LLM, ethical lobbying, but they had a few problems and he pulled out of that. Made him a millionaire, so it wasn't too bad. But this, of course, was the gentleman who was speaking out in the Lords, and he said this: I want to make the following staccato points. First, we spend 856 million. Unfortunately, this is spent principally on national security and too little is given to the other side. He means cybersecurity. It would be nice if the government would give that more consideration. We welcome the appointment of the former British ambassador to Israel, Matthew Gould, who will have a key role in cybersecurity inside the Cabinet Office, a very useful and important position. So there is the big push for Matthew Gould. And why are we interested in that man? Well, this was the network which Francis Maude had set up, linking British intelligence organisations, including GCHQ, into a cooperative programme with Israel, and included universities and some of the top Israeli spy centres, University of Bristol even in it. And now we've brought into that this gentleman, here we are, Mr. Gould, Matthew Gould, and when he was ambassador, Britain's ambassador for Israel, he boasted that as a member of the Jewish community himself, he was also an ambassador for Israel. So many people said, well, how can this possibly work? And it seems to us that what we've got here is a strengthening of the Israeli hand in UK cybersecurity. Any comments that you could possibly give us on this? I'll say that our position is that we find this concerning.
I would find it concerning too, not because it's Israel, but because it is a sovereign country that isn't the UK. I hope that isn't too facile a point.
It fits in quite nicely with how we approached this in the beginning, because we were talking about the subject of security. This was, I would say, about 2 years ago. And I used the example, what would we say if most of our political circles and intelligence services were linked in with the Italians? I think people would actually have some comment about it. But it does rather seem that if that cooperation and collaboration is with Israel, then we're not allowed to talk about it, or people are reluctant to talk. But yes, it could be any company, any country, and we would still be asking the question, why is this allowed to happen? We'll see if we can get some response from the Cabinet Office themselves, but I rather think there'll be a wall of silence because it's a matter of national security. Well, if we're paying 856 million for the benefits of being protected, it's a shame that the Goddard inquiry has apparently been losing emails and deleting emails. Are they able to stop the paedophiles at work? Well, this was sent in to us, and what it is showing is an email returned from the Goddard inquiry saying that an email to them reporting suspected child abuse with possible links to Hollywood and beyond was deleted without being read on the 15th December 2015. So this is pretty amazing that this inquiry, which has already deleted data, is now showing that you send them information, well, we don't even bother to read it. Mike, I'm just going to say, I'm almost lost for comments on this. Is this a real inquiry, or is this thing a scam?
Increasingly, it's looking like a scam, isn't it? Because they seem to be protecting themselves. I was mildly amused to see that the NSPCC continues to hold events. They were advertising an event yesterday, which was about asking the question, has the allegations, or have the allegations of VIP child abuse gone too far? Have we stepped over a line? You know, this type of rhetoric coming from the NSPCC, and this is the organisation which is providing much of the infrastructure to the Goddard inquiry. So, you know, the charge of cover-up is a reasonable one, I believe.
Yeah. Well, we're going to keep digging on this one. Of course, the Goddard inquiry simply did not want to tell us, the UK column, who was in charge of those IT systems when this data was supposedly destroyed. We believe it was the Home Office, but we haven't got a reply from Goddard inquiry. Maybe those IT systems were actually being run by NSPCC people. Transparent? No. Well, problems with children and child abuse in Holland, Alex, and you've picked out this report about the aristocracy, the kakistocracy in Holland. Now, this article's come out of a Russian source but relates to the Netherlands. What's actually going on here?
Yes, I'm not really aware of the relationship between pravda.ru, which you can see the icon for there, and the URL concerned, which is pravdareport.com. So I'm not certain whether this is from the Russian newspaper Pravda or from some other outlet. Be that as it may, we have a very, very dischuffed Dutchman here, which in itself is a rare thing. And the timeliness element is twofold. First of all, the Dutch ambassador in Moscow recently made rather gauche comments about the Russian occupation of Crimea, highly undiplomatic. And secondly, there is, and this is the next slide you have, a trial by the public prosecutors of Joris Demmink. But if we go just for a moment back to that previous slide, the writer here, Hans Vogel, I'm assuming that he is very critical of the government of the Netherlands and lives either in the Netherlands or Russia. What he's talking about here is that the worst, most morally corrupt elements in society have floated to the top. And it happens so often, Brian, that what happened in the Netherlands is a mirror for the British establishment. It's a very similar system to Britain in some ways. And at the same time, the difference is that it is a civil law jurisdiction. The Constitution is in a single document. People follow the rules. People make a big noise when the rules are not followed, unlike Britain. And so we can often see transparently reflected in the Netherlands what goes on deep under the surface in Britain, and that will become very clear on the next slide. But this first one here, Joris Demmink, who we're going to hear about on the next slide, is described by this author as the retired Secretary General of the Ministry of Security and Justice. Yes, since 2010, the same ministry has done both things in the Netherlands. Joris Demmink was the kingpin of the government paedophile network of the Netherlands for 30 years, the last 10 of which he was head of ministry, the top civil servant. Under his auspices, writes Hans Vogel, blackmailable people were appointed to all the key offices of the Dutch state. In order to be eligible for high state office, one had to be preferably a homosexual, even better, a paedophile. If one did not meet these criteria, one must at least have been present at some ugly paedophile party, where sometimes even innocent children, even infants, are sacrificed. And this isn't just Vogel making it up. I've seen the Dutch language documentary. The Dutch are brilliant at investigative journalism, in which the chap we'll be talking about in a moment takes the investigative journalists to the place in The Hague where he was, he says, twice abused in Demmink's official chauffeured car outside a particular building in 1988. So that's all been told. Now, Demmink's downfall, and maybe we can move on to the next slide here. Demmink's downfall is the fact that the boys whom he allegedly buggered in Turkey reported it to the Turkish authorities, and of course a so-called backwards Muslim country like Turkey won't have any truck with paedophilia, unlike advanced countries like the Netherlands and Britain, with their so-called Christian governments. So the Turkish boys who say they were abused by Demmink when he made official visits to Turkey have finally got the public prosecutor in the Netherlands to take it seriously, years after his retirement from a 30-year-long civil service career. And this really illustrates to me the folly of banning private prosecutions. They were banned in the Netherlands in the 20s. They're very rare in Scotland. There's only been 3 last century. They're still commonplace, thank God, in England and Wales. And it was just on a wing and a prayer that this alleged victim, Bart von Well, managed to get the case taken seriously. Finally, he's managed to get ministers to be forced to appear, to be subpoenaed, who were colleagues of Demmink's. In fact, they were his bosses because they were politicians and he was a civil servant. And the case that the Dutch Crown, through the public prosecutor, is now making against Mr. Demmink is that he was complicit with ministers, and on the other hand, that the Crown is liable because the Dutch Crown knew jolly well, is the argument, that there was a paedophile ring acting with impunity. The allegations are detailed. There are some fearless journalists speaking out against it. The Turks are outraged. But here's the most important paragraph before we have to move on. The writer of the first article I told you about, Hans Vogel, says this: by the way, in Britain, they have the same system. And then he names some names well known to the UK column. The system is only effective as long as foreign governments do not discover the personal details, that is the pederasty, of the highest ranking participants. When they do, when foreign governments do discover this dirty secret, they can get whatever they want through blackmail. And the allegation is that in the Dutch case, the Turks said, hand over the Kurdish activist that you have as a citizen or refugee in the Netherlands. And of course, the Netherlands had to, despite all the noises it makes about human rights.
This is very significant stuff, Alex, because, of course, let us just take the alleged incident with David Cameron and the pig. Of course, what did that incident represent? If it happened, our Prime Minister on that subject alone is open to blackmail. And you're absolutely right, it's blackmail which enables the foreign powers to do the dirty deeds on anybody who's been involved with the children. So are we surprised to see this massive cover-up of the British government at the moment? Absolutely not. Isn't it interesting that you're describing this going on in the Netherlands? And of course, we've had connections between the abuse of youngsters at Elm Guest House and paedophile connections through to Rotterdam in the Netherlands. So it's going on in both countries. These are rings at very high level. We need to get the top off it. How can we be governed by people who are at best criminals but are at worst also abusing children? You have also picked, interesting, it's a Dutch article, but of course it's come out of Christopher Booker, or come from Christopher Booker's pen in the Telegraph. Children being stolen by Dutch social services.
This is from the indefatigable Christopher Booker, who is one of the very few mainstream journalists who's taken it seriously, that there's been a wave of child thefts. And the timeliness here is really that it's a year since the child in question was returned home. And that is what gives hope, I would hope, to those many in Britain who've had their children stolen from them and who are in absolute despair, is that if you keep pushing like this Latvian family did, you may get somewhere, although perhaps not with the British authorities. Now, the core of this, and you must really read this, it's from 2013, is that a privatized spin-off of the Youth Welfare Bureau, and in the Netherlands that's done regionally. So it was a particular region of the Netherlands called Gelderland where this intervention happened. They decided, for the three reasons you got on the screen there, that this Russian family, Latvia was just their nationality, maybe not even their citizenship, but they were Russian really, that this family should have the children taken from them. The reasons are complicated, but you've summarized them there. This is the crime in the view of the private company that can steal children from parts of the Netherlands now. Children are speaking their native language at home. Crime. The family might make a trip from one EU member state to another. Crime. The children have feelings for both parents. Crime. And you put on there what Christopher Booker makes of all this. But the courageous stepbrother, who I think you're going to mention in a moment, filmed the arrest or the confiscation of the children, was vexatiously arrested multiple times, continued his media campaign, took it to the European Parliament, presented it in tears before MEPs, and in the end, the Dutch were so embarrassed, they're very sensitive to embarrassment, the Dutch, that a court in the Netherlands was forced to go by the book and to concede that Jeugdzorg Gelderland, that's the Youth Care, ironic name, agency for the province of Gelderland, had made three false arguments and that the child had to go home. Now, that final step is what we don't see in Britain, is it? In fact, we've seen quite the opposite recently. You've covered a case where a British judge said that a child had been falsely confiscated, but the adoption was done and dusted, so let the child grow up with those who had falsely been given the child. So that's what makes the Dutch model of child theft different from Britain's, is that even though it's a civil law jurisdiction here and you're only ever going to get a judge sitting alone, never a jury, they don't exist in this country, despite that, if a judge can have a serious argument presented to him that people acted ultra vires beyond their powers, he will, as often as not, say, yes, you're quite right, make undone all that you did.
I'll just read out, Alex, thank you for taking us through that. I'll just read out what Christopher Booker actually said. Pretty well everything about this case echoes what goes on behind closed doors in England. Social workers colluding with a dysfunctional father to justify snatching distraught children from their mother, to incarcerate them miserably in care homes, the courts refusing to test evidence and accepting lies. And I can say that is absolutely correct. I have been inside family courts myself where social services presented false evidence. It was perjury. In the worst case, the judge simply said, oh, well, I can see you've made a mistake. An absolute disgrace. But it's the publicity that's made the difference. Encourage people to go and have a look at this film clip. It is as harrowing as the baby taken away that UK Column first put up about 3 years ago, I think it was now. You can hear the children screaming and crying in the background. And then this police person, I'm not sure whether that's a man or a woman actually, but police person says you're not to film and comes to try and to stop the film. What does the film tell us? These people are terrified of exposure. And this is one of the key weapons, the truth about what they're doing, which is stealing, kidnapping and brutalising children. And the fact that if you can get the evidence out in front of the wider public, we're well on our way to dealing with the problem. But Alex, we've got to thank you for exposing this lady. We reported on her a few months ago, Gudella Likens, who was a beauty queen and UN Goodwill Ambassador for Sexual Health. And she was running a pretty disgusting program in British schools encouraging young teenagers to talk explicitly about sex and their sexual experiences and their bodies. And this was promoted as being a good thing, even in the papers. It was sort of shock, but they promoted it. And you've revealed this to us, that she's told RTL late night that she wanted children sexualised. She wants them sexualised. Yes.
The title of the Volkskrant article here is referring to a documentary, if we can grace it with that name, that went out on a Dutch TV channel recently. And I'm sure you can translate that headline yourself, Brian. Eerst bla bla and dan boom boom.
Yeah, I think we get it. I think we get it across the cultural divide with the Netherlands.
And this is Miss Leeken's advice, because as she's been teaching children in the West Midlands how to have sex, she's also been teaching Dutch children on TV how to have sex. And this is too disgusting to translate, but I'll read you one line from the Volkskrant article, which is on screen there. This is talking about what a young underage teenager wanted from her boyfriend. She was telling Goede Leekens about it. Behalve gevarieerde tongen wilden ze ook kinky sex en meer romantiek. This is what the girl wanted, and Goede Leekens gave her tips on how to get it, and then Goede Leekens comes back breathless with the cameras to say, well now, did that work? Did you get what you wanted from your boyfriend? And as the Dutch journalist describes it, dat bleek het geval te zijn. Bam bam, boom boom, alles tegelijk. Yeah. So, job done, Goede Leekens, you have sexualized another couple in, to use a Dutch expression, kinky sex.
And of course, as has been pointed out in the UK column chat room, where does this come from? It comes from the United Nations UNESCO programme and the Lucis Trust, formerly, of course, the Lucifer Trust. So if you're a parent concerned about your child or children being sexualised, look no further than political policy of the United Nations. Mike, take us into another area.
Well, actually, in some ways, this is right back to the beginning, because this is Namat Safiq, who is Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, and employment figures out today showing a further fall in unemployment. So that's really good news, isn't it? And increasing levels of employment. And of course, her message over the last couple of days has been that Britain now it has more or less full employment, because 5% unemployment or thereabouts is pretty much what it's always been. It's pretty much what it always will be. So we're now fully employed, so that's good. So I thought I would just quickly have a look at where these new jobs have come from. And this is the graph from the Office for National Statistics. And it's showing mainly in coffee serving and retail, so shelf stacking and this kind of thing, some transport, accommodation and food services, arts, entertainment, recreation, and other. Now, the professional, scientific and technical have done reasonably well, but of course, if you take the other jobs as a block, the sort of non-technical, non-professional jobs as a block, then the professional jobs, the high-quality, higher-paid jobs, significantly lower number of those created over the last period. So here's the point that I really wanted to make here, because statistics on this really began to be collected in 1978. And so just let's compare Britain's manufacturing capability since 1978, when 27% or so of GDP was generated through high, productivity and manufacturing. It's now 8%. So that really demonstrates where the British economy has gone. And of course, Mark Carnage is going to do everything to sort that out.
Okay, Mike, thank you very much. Well, the government, of course, continues to lie. This is the problem at the moment with UK. We have a criminal elite in Westminster, and of course, we can't expect the country to run properly. I'll just end firstly by thanking Alex for joining us. We hope to see you again, and it will be very interesting to continue to get that picture of what's actually happening in Europe. We don't seem to be getting much of a report on that from BBC or the other mainstream outlets as to be expected. So thank you very much for joining us, Alex. And a big thank you also to the Penzance Cornwall group that set up a talk last night on the subject of immigration. I gave that talk. It was a fascinating experience. We had a very, very interesting debate. And yes, there was a mixed audience, so other nationalities present. And one of the key things that came out, of course, is that everybody, no matter what their race or colour or background, have now become frightened to speak out on the matter of race. This is what the government's race relation policies are about: fear, creating fear amongst the communities in UK. But we were able to get through that. And an interesting report by a person who said that they'd had a visit by the government's Protect team into a local school, and they found that to be a very frightening experience because, as they said, they felt that anyone who criticised the government in any way was likely to be listed as a potential terrorist. This, of course, is exactly what the UK column has been warning of. And I'll also add that as I drove down to give that talk on immigration, I was very interested to hear the government advertising its own special organisation helping exporters, and it said that if you were a company with social services experience, then your experience was badly needed in Poland because there is nobody left to look after old people. So we need British social workers now to move across into Poland in order to help the elderly people. Why are there very few facilities to look after the elderly in Poland? Because traditionally families and the children have always undertaken that role, historically undertaken that role, and those children are now in UK and other European countries. And I'll end on that subject on that note. I'll also say that there is a very important debate going on at the weekend in Warwick, which is having a look at the monetarisation of mortgages, the Great Mortgage Scandal, and we will put up some details about the location for that meeting on the UK column website. Well, that's it for today. It's getting ever more obvious to see the scam, the lies, the propaganda that's coming out of the British government, and it's up to all of us to tell the truth, spread the word, and expose what is really happening. Don't our children deserve it? Thanks very much for joining us. We'll be back same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.